Welcome everyone who is listening to this conversation. This is a recorded conversation between us at Advaya as well as with one of the teachers on our upcoming course, Rewilding Mythology, Dr. Patricia Kaishian. And so Dr. Patricia Kaishian is a mycologist and visiting professor of biology at Bard College in New York. Her research focuses on fungal taxonomy, diversity, evolution, symbiosis, and ecology. Her work, The Science Underground Mycology as a Queer Discipline, appears in Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, Technoscience. Her forthcoming book, Forest Euphoria, will be published by Milkweed Editions. I know this wasn't part of the questions, but Patty, I just found out through reading your bio about your forthcoming book. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that or let us know where that is.
Yeah, thank you for asking. It is, I would say, still in the earlier phases, but I'm writing a book that will be in the realm of queer ecology, natural history, and a bit memoir, sort of. And it'll be a collection of essays that sort of explore a diversity of organisms and systems and apply a queer ecological lens to these beings and their situated position within society. So often, kind of maligned beings, but doing so in a way that invites people to have a deeper relationship with those specific organisms, the ecosystems around us more broadly, and I think hopefully also with the reader themselves and their relationship to nature. I hope to publish a few of the essays that are contained within the book as they'll trickle some of them out before. So hopefully actually in the next couple months, there'll be one of those essays will come out. Stay tuned. I hope to finish up in the next, I don't know, I don't want to say for sure, but hopefully within the year. So
yeah. Amazing. And I'm really excited for the book. It sounds really great, and really excited for the essays that will be coming out as well. And I hope people also stay tuned to check out your book that will be releasing, and I'm sure it'll be on the Advaya radar as well. So it'll be really exciting to see. And so now that we've talked about that, I wanted to open into the main conversation. And so I wanted to begin with you talking about your Armenian roots. And I know that on the For the Wild podcast that you were on, you shared about your work at the International Congress of Armenian Mycologists and how it's central to your career at the moment. And so I wanted to mention this because I think it's been on my mind a lot when you said biodiversity declines with colonialism. I think those two words, biodiversity and colonialism, aren't usually put together, especially by people within the biodiversity space or young biodiversity advocates and environmentalists. And so when you said that and about the ethic of land care being deeply embedded in Armenian culture, it's been something that I think kind of echoed what Ayesha Siddiqa said about Pakistan and Celine Zaman about Lebanon. And so I was thinking about the culture of war and colonial violence against the land and about how diasporas from those lands that have suffered from oppressions think about protecting biodiversity. And for some context, I'm also thinking about the term post-apocalyptic peoples, which I came across by Akamolafe's work, but also through a lot of indigenous scholars in talking about the kind of mass extinction that we're witnessing and how that parallels with extinctions in history, histories of violence, histories of genocide. And I think this is kind of a broad and open question, but I wanted you to speak to how your positionality affects how you view biodiversity and conservation work and species extinction, and talk about how kind of your roots have brought you to this work in a way that is different from maybe other people who have had different entry points into the same space.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for asking about this. So I think I'll give a tiny bit of context about Armenia for those who may be unfamiliar with the history. I find that a lot of people are unfamiliar with Armenia's history because it's such a small ethnic minority group in a very geopolitically complex region. But Armenia is a country in West Asia, and in the late 1800s, early 1900s, began a series of ethnic cleansing events against Armenians carried out by the Ottoman Empire, and sort of most horrifically culminating in the Armenian genocide, which happened around 1915, in which upwards of 1.5 million Armenians were killed through campaigns of extermination, death marches through the Syrian desert, and so forth. And that only left behind around 200,000 to 300,000 Armenians who survived. And then subsequently, the violence has not actually, I think it crescendoed with the genocide, but there's been a sustained campaign of violence against Armenians that transformed from the Ottoman Empire into the Turkic, present day state of Turkey and their sort of brother state, Azerbaijan. So throughout all of the 1900s, there were pogroms and other ethnic cleansing events in both Armenia proper and in the colonized territory of what is now Eastern Turkey or Western Armenia. And this there have been periods of sort of relative stability, but most recently in 2020 there was a war to reclaim the indigenous lands of Artsakh, which is also referred to as Nagorno-Karabakh, which was technically internationally recognized land in possession that was gifted sort of to Azerbaijan after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but had been inhabited by Armenians for thousands of years, and 90% of the population was Armenian. And in this war, thousands of Armenians died and were displaced, and thousands more were displaced. And the war was quite brutal and activated for many of us a intergenerational trauma that I think people of around my age hadn't really experienced in such an acute way because of the relative peace that had been in the region since the 90s. So in response to this, living in the United States, which is where I live, I felt very powerless, but very, at the same time, somatically affected and emotionally affected in this way, but felt, not unsure about how to leverage my training as a scientist and my relatively little amount of dollars. How do I kind of leverage my capacity as a scientist to bring relief or bring support to my ancestral lands and my friends and colleagues who live in Armenia now. So we formed with a few of my friends who are all ethnically Armenian and mycologists, a group of the called the International Congress of Armenian Mycologists. And our intention is explicitly political in that we see our stewardship of the land and our care for fungi, which are often the most overlooked of all of the organisms, as integral to the well-being of Armenia. And because of the position of constantly defending oneself against nations trying to colonize you further, Armenia has had to divert funds away from science and education and conservation into defense. They have a tiny GDP. It's like the size of Vermont's, and they're going up against some of the world's largest militaries, as Azerbaijan, for example, is financed heavily by the United States. So it's a very much a David and Goliath situation. So it's very, very dire in many ways, and it's thought of as, an existential crisis in that Azerbaijan explicitly, politicians from the country have stated that their explicit desire is to wipe Armenia off the map. And there's a very eugenicist sort of logic behind their hatred of Armenians. There's a very much rooted in, it's not just a material war for resources. It really is a hateful genocidal agenda because it is they specifically talk about continuing the work of their forefathers. So it's not, they don't even really disguise this kind of dimension to the conflict. So, sometimes it can, there might, at first it feels like, what is the connection really? Okay, fungi, war, and ethnic cleansing, it seems like this could be a trivial thing compared to that. But what we and our group have come to believe in fully is that there is no life worth living without a biodiversity that is protected, that is flourishing, that is thriving. And part of the violence against Armenians is to claim the land. And in doing so, it's often burned and torched and sort of, razed to the ground. And that is sort of used by Azerbaijan as proof of like, as a way of, scaring Armenians, but it also is like evidencing their own lack of connection to that land. And they're enacting violence upon the land, again, which is knowing that it would hurt the Armenians, who in fact have a very deep connection. So there's this kind of, this is where it's working in the abstract, but in the material, there's this, we know that this is true, that with colonization, there's a decline in biodiversity, and this plays out all over the world, whether it's in the Americas, the so-called Americas, whether it's in the continental Africa. It doesn't matter where this happens. When you have people come in and violently dispossess indigenous peoples of their land, there is also a decline of of many other species, plants, fungi, animals. And these things are not coincidental. It's not a kind of happenstance or a byproduct of, this like a net loss. It's actually something, it's facultative. It's part of the process, right? To successfully alienate organ beings from their space requires, a whole apparatus of violence that doesn't start with just the interpersonal, but it means it's dislocating through, establishing new types of agricultural systems, through forcibly relocating plants from wherever you came from into this new habitat, and severing ties that are reciprocal between the people that have lived there previously and the species that they have, over hundreds of generations developed very detailed care for. And also, another key logic at play in the connection between colonization, or, in the case of Armenia, and the resistance, right, is rejecting the logics that would position one organism higher than the other as worthy of saving, right? So we can all get behind this idea of saving large charismatic megafauna, right? Or, wild cats or big eagles. And of course, I love those animals too and want them to be protected. But part of like trying to reimagine futures in which, we have maximum human vitality, we have to think about maximizing the vitality of creatures that we have often overlooked but so deeply need. And fungi 100% are in this category of being overlooked but yet critical to survival. So there's this secondary messaging here too, is like, yes, we can come in and, yes, Armenia should be conserved in all ways. We're focusing on fungi because it's our expertise, but also because there's this powerful message there of the interconnectedness. In Armenian, there is this proverb called "unity is strength" or "unity is power," and I like thinking about that in this idea of networks and connectedness that fungi sort of so beautifully demonstrate for us.
Thank you for sharing that. I think there's a lot there.
Go on.
For sure. But I think so that resonates very beautifully. I think the last part, especially when you were talking about using your expertise to draw kind of attention to what is commonly overlooked. Although I think there is something to be said, and I think you've mentioned this before, also about how like fungi has been kind of this new cool thing that everyone's now hopping on board. It's almost becoming a charismatic species in itself. I think it's really interesting how
it is, yeah. I'm having to readjust some of my thinking about it because I've for years now just have had to make this argument, but you're right, it is kind of starting to change.
Yeah, and I just was reading Tom Van Doren's book A World in a Shell, in which he talks about snails in Hawaii and how it's going extinct really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And that argument can be applied very nicely in that the idea of like what's on kind of the ground and what's small and what's not seen. I mean, previously that was fungi, but now more seen. But yeah, but so I think it would be a nice segue to the question about extinction,
Mm-hmm.
which is a recurring theme here, I think, at Advaya, because we've been talking about we're constantly talking about spiritual ecology,
Mm-hmm.
and especially now with the upcoming courses, talking a lot about death and how that's kind of central to life.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a very broad statement and needs to be like qualified. But so I think what I want to talk about is not so much about the kind of not the typical like Anthropocene kind of approach to extinction,
Mm-hmm.
but more of the way that Sophie talks about it. So Sophie Strand, who said recently that extinction events create openings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that openings draw in biological experimentation. And she talks about the spaces that are left behind by extinction. And I think also with Tom Van Doren's work, where he talks about stories about extinction being transformative and drawing us into new worlds. And he talks also about how there needs to be kind of complexity and responsibility in that. So it's not kind of I don't want to like romanticize extinction, but at the same time, I think there's a need to kind of change the way we think about it. And I would also like to draw in Anna Singh's work. I was very like personally inspired by her book, which is like sitting on my shelf
Mm-hmm.
where she I think talks about mushrooms fruiting up at kind of sites of ruin, sites of destruction, sites that have been ravaged by capitalism. And I think there's something there also in your essay continuation, which is very dense but very but in which you shared quote, death is not the opposite of continuity, but rather a component structure, end quote. So I wanted you to share what comes up for you here, and how you're thinking about extinction at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the texture of this like question and these ideas because there's so many like surfaces to it, right? Like, so I think I'm pulled first to talk about this idea of like, and this kind of echoes Bio Okumolafe's discussion of what was the exact phrase of a, about surviving apocalypse. What was the exact phrase that he uses there?
Oh,
The post-apocalyptic people. Is that right?
yes,
Okay.
post-apocalyptic.
Yeah. So I think that as a descendant of genocide survivors, like for me, I think a lot about how the end of the world has already happened for so many people, right? And I mean, obviously, I think genocide is one of the biggest, especially ones as I mean, well, there's no small genocide. All of but I guess I'll speak for my own lineage, which is that like just a fragment of the population remained afterwards, and like I think a lot about how also like more Armenians live in diaspora than live in the actual country of Armenia, right? There's only about 3 million, less than 3 million Armenians live in Armenia, a tiny country, and so there's many of us in the U.S., in Lebanon, in Syria, in Palestine, in Russia, Iran, so sort of scattered mostly in the Middle East, but also in the U.S. So the experience of being Armenian is this post-apocalyptic experience for the majority of living Armenians, right? Is this to be severed, to be deeply detached from generational knowledge from whole world life worlds of the organisms you evolved with in your landscape, the language itself, you know. So I find that to be obviously deeply sad, but also there, is always these little spores of resilience that come up, that germinate in this pain, I think. And I think that so part of me, I get a little bit frustrated with the very doomer sort of attitude towards the current climate situation, and I often find that coming from people who maybe, maybe not coincidentally, are not from post-apocalyptic peoples, and I find that to be that type of pessimism in the light of not even having had these cataclysmic events happen to your lineage. I just find it really inappropriate. And in fact, I think the people, I don't know, I find that, if anything, there should be more energy for you to be fighting this and to believe in alternatives and to, I don't know. So I reject the deeply negative, deeply doomer outlook on climate change. I think it's devastatingly scary. I think it's extremely real, and much suffering is in our future. But I also believe there is something in me that maybe, this idea of possibilities of regrowth, rebirth, shifting growth, opportunities for reincarnations of past lives that maybe didn't have a chance before. I don't know. So there's that element. And then there's the real, like, sort of biological fact of the fact that 99% or more of all of the species that have ever once existed on Earth are now extinct, right? So the extinction is inherently a part of life on Earth, and it has been so for billions of years. And in and of itself is not necessarily something to be feared, in that often when extinction occurs, it gives rise to new species, not just because new niches open up, but because a species is transformed, and that the previous species, like it's the chicken or the egg kind of thing, but it's like, a species, it becomes anew. I mean, of course, there are end of the lines, and those maybe, much is lost there in terms of the vitality of the genetic information and the lineage of that information. But often extinction is, speciation of a sort. But that's not, again, not to romanticize mass extinction, which is what we are in now the throes of, what is being considered the sixth mass extinction event. And there's no other way of saying that this is very, very real and potentially, cataclysmic. But I don't, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to maintain, not let the fear of that interrupt potential actions and possibilities that we could be mobilizing around now. That's not, there isn't, I mean, it, there are again, harms have already occurred, devastating floods, droughts, all of this is happening now. It's very material, and people die. So I'm not saying that you have to pretend that that's not horrible, but what should not happen is to believe that simply because you are alive now, it is the end of the world, because there's this main character thing there that comes up, that, yeah, again, I often find it from coming through in, honestly, white men the most, some of the most climate doomerist people I know, and who do the least amount of organizing, frankly. And I just don't, I don't have any tolerance for that. So,
yeah, I think there's something to be said about the kind of lack of resilience in these sort of, in the doomer perspective and pessimistic. And I also, on that note, like, I kind of the kind of pessimism within, like, academic circles, especially within people who are academics who occupy positions of privilege, then having this sort of like, it's the end of the world kind of, it feels very like out of touch with like the deep time approach that I'm hearing from the scholars who come from backgrounds of peoples who
Yeah.
have already lived through apocalypses.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I agree. I see it a lot in the academic spaces.
Yeah. And actually, on that note, I wanted to ask you, this is kind of a little bit off the script, but I wanted to invite you to expand on your thought, the idea of death not being the opposite of continuity,
Mm.
um, and also invite you to speak a little bit on like deep time, which is something that um, I think feels very abstract to a lot of people, but is actually a very accessible and useful idea and framework to think through what we're going through, but also to have a more grounded perspective on things. So I wanted to.
Right. Yeah. So I think maybe I'll start with like this idea of deep time, because I think that will enable me to explain the first part of your question better, which is so deep time is an attempt to think about. I mean, our brains are really truly not capable of grasping like the fact that Earth, how old the Earth is, right? That's billions of years old, and we can't really grasp like even a few. I think even years is hard to grasp, like for a person, right? Um, like a year. I mean, yeah, like which actually just want to a quick aside, which is why I think like prison is torture. Like the way time is imprisons a person who's restricted in this way. Like 5 years is such a long time. Like we say it like, oh, a 5 year sentence. That's not so long for a person to go to jail for. And it's like that 5 years is an eternity in this way. And so think about how many sensorial experiences you would fit into 5 years. It's like infinite, right? So we actually have trouble with time in various scales, I think. But deep time, of course, is even harder to grasp, but it's still extremely useful to sort of imagine our own, in the context of our biology and our relationships to other beings, right? So I study, for example, these fungi that live on arthropods, and they're ectobionts, you could say, or some call them parasites. But they basically have had this very deep co-evolutionary relationship with their host, the insect. Usually, it's like a beetle, and these fungi have been living on these insects we think hundreds of millions of years, and the sensitivities that they have to one another's bodies are really hard to grasp. Like, unless you think about how evolution functions on this in this like the minutia of material sort of interlockings and responses, this sort of like very very gradual process of kind of learning the other, right, which is stretched out, and like the tiniest little chemical change on the host body would maybe signal to the fungus that only could you survive here if this mutation occurs, and then which enables you to react to this compound. And it's evolution is largely driven by these random mutation events, and the way this functions is that all mutations are random, but they are acted upon sometimes non-randomly by the environment, right? So there's this mutation arises and enables, say, for example, a fungus to develop a compound that is stickier to like on the spore when it lands on the host, and it's just like by just a tiny little change in a carbon and a hydrogen, it's now just a little bit more adhesive, right? And that tiny shift happened randomly, but then because it had some benefit, then it can kind of play out through the population like differentially, right? So suddenly the one that has this little mutation is able to grow faster on the fungus, produce more spores, and then the spores contain the code for that mutation, and then it can kind of grow, slowly move through the population, become more and more dominant, to the eventually perhaps becoming the only expression of this, adhesive in the population, right? But like thinking about how this is how evolution plays out for every single aspect of our entire everything that we have in our bodies or that we interact with, are these tiny events. And I never get tired of thinking about this. Like every time I like let myself my mind wander in this area, I'm just like cannot fathom the scale and the improbability of the, all of these things happening, and any given like evolutionary outcome is just like fantastically improbable, right? And it's a profound intimacy that has driven our evolution, and it is always symbiosis. It's again, also our cellular components being symbiotic, right? We have the organelles within our cells were former bacteria that were absorbed by other bacteria and then became component structures, right? So therein is an example of sort of like a partial death, right? Where the smaller bacteria that was absorbed by the larger one, it did not, that species eventually no longer existed, but it came into a different source of energy and power. And then within that larger cell could survive in an entirely new way, right? And that's how we have multicellularity and cellular organisms, right? So this is this idea of like that lineage is extinct in that it's no longer a free living species, and it's now only decipherable or recognizable in the context of its current structure and current reliance on a larger cell. So I'm thinking like this is our mitochondria and the chloroplasts in our cell, right? But this idea is, I don't know, here this is where sort of like death is mingling with life, and like to be created is to like kind of give something up, right? Or to transition, to move out of, to become anew. So I think that I wrote this piece that you mentioned, continuation, for an artist, Lily Cox Richard, who invited me to collaborate with her at an exhibit at the Massachusetts Museum of Modern Art. And so it's a short piece, but yeah, it's very dense, and it's like I'm kind of playing around with this idea, continuation, as like living life as this like process, right? As a and kind of the continual existence, this vitality that is in these unbroken chains of bacterial events, essentially. And in that, so like death in these cases often, like to die, right, was to like the existence of the category of life necessitated the like death, right? So to become a living thing in this biological definitional sense, right? Death was that was the outcome of organizing cells in these particular ways. Their particular complexities are a function of the fact that they're impermanent. And this is something that like, and they're resulting like greater and greater complexities mean that the impermanence is even greater, right? Or even more pronounced. And so there's this like idea, right, that there isn't, that like death is not such a bad thing. It is, I mean, like grief is a terrible thing. But this idea of death is makes for life anew, and whether that is in this just very direct, nutrient giving, like a nurse log in a forest, a tree that's fallen, and then for years and years just seeds the carbon and nitrogen into the space and habitat and all of this, or whether it's this idea of a species, the end of a species line, or a species line taking a definitive turn, leaving behind some of the population, and so the new population can kind of become this new thing. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I was going with that.
Thank you for expanding upon that. And I think what I'm thinking about now is just, and I don't know if this thought will go anywhere, but I think yeah, like there's a struggle, I think, in this conversation I'm seeing, but also like just generally, and something that I've been thinking about is just like it's difficult to kind of the articulating thoughts around death is a very like difficult, I mean, understandably very difficult thing to talk about, and it's even more difficult to kind of map how like death occurs and extinction occurs in the kind of ecological world onto like our human world, and I'm wondering like why that's the case. It, it's not, I don't know if it's really a question, it's just kind of like a reflecting thing that I'm really,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, and
I always think of things being in, for just a physics idea, right? For every action, oversimplifies physics idea, but for every action, there's a reaction, or this idea, like, for the greater complexity of evolution came all of these other trade-offs, right? So like multicellularity, and would, obviously we are one of these multicellular beings, with highly differentiated parts. With that comes this like incredible capacity to feel all manner of like emotion and pleasure. And I think I like this idea of exploring like pleasure as actually like this driving force in evolution, right? This the seeking of warmth, of contact, of nutrition, of love, of connection, of play, right? And then but always for every heightened experience, there's another heightened experience in the like of a different of same magnitude but of a different direction. And just always these things are pulled. So I think that like pleasure, I like to think about pleasure driving evolution as organisms seek these comforts, right? But the greater the sensitivity to you have to these comforts, and the greater the elaborate mechanisms that have evolved to like seek those comforts effectively, make you so vulnerable also to like the pains of the world, right? To feel pain. So I think a lot of people in this Darwinian, neo-Darwinian sense think of evolution being first driven by the pain aspect, right? That pain and struggle and fighting is what really drives evolution, and whatever weird byproducts we're kind of dabbling in as we experience like the absurdity of life is just a coincidence. But pain is, but I like to invert that. I think that all organisms sort of have some capacity for sensational, I don't know, just positivity, right? Something that draws them, something that makes them feel like a click in their chemistry. And but then again, this, but pain is like a byproduct of that. It's an ansel, it's the secondary, unintended effect, right? And we do lots of things to avoid that pain, but obviously it's not fully escapable. It can just be intellectualized or shifted or whatever. But
yeah, it's definitely like integral to life, like all of these things, like pleasure and pain, and they're all very linked together. And I think that that's again a very nice segue into to the question about your essay, Purple Thunder, Mushrooms and Desire, in which you wrote that you knew little about the world, but you knew it was you were full of desire. And you saw that the capacity for pleasure and joy is fundamental to being alive, which is what you're talking about. And now you write as a mycologist in tune with and guided by these experiences. You see evidence for resonant cellular pleasure as a mechanism for evolution. So I think that phrase resonant cellular pleasure is so evocative, um, which is really nice. And you were just talking about, I think, the Darwinian kind of as you write in that essay, the kind of disproportionate emphasis on conflict, on fitness, competition, which I'm like growing increasingly tired of people telling me. Also just upset that like I was taught,
Yeah.
everyone was taught in biology that was like the fundamental way that life moved, is through all this like competition, and you have to like fight your way to winning.
Yeah.
Which is such a strange way. Not strange. I mean, I can see where it
It
comes from.
tracks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think I really appreciate people who are in the science world and talking about or trying to enliven it through this perspective of pleasure, this perspective of desire, and yearning, which is something that Andreas Weber really talks about in his work around enlivenment. Um, so I'm thinking about all these things and kind of wondering how I want you to speak to a little bit how you knew the world was full of desire. And I mean, I didn't intuitively know that. I think it's really interesting to hear that you said that from a young age, that was something that the way you looked at the world. So
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So I mean, I certainly didn't have like a scientific explanation for it when I was young, but there was something, so the idea that I'm exploring in that essay, um, is like, it's a both like a reclamation of, childlike wonder as a valid sort of means of being a scientist, and also like kind of like sharing that I don't know that I ever lost that desire as a child. Like there have been periods of my life where I maybe was more or less distant to it, but there was something that there's a pretty clear for me, like unbroken pathway between being this child that saw the world in this, like all children really do, like in this very porous way, a way of being kind of like just of high excitement, high curiosity. And then this is actually going to be a large topic of my book, but sort of the ways in which I held onto that feeling, and how it kept me safe in these particular ways as I dealt with my own personal like struggles and my own queerness, for example. Um, so it's kind of hard to just give a nuance or a quick explainer on, but there's this feeling that in my own pursuit as a scientist that I'm like kind of like very clearly involved in this childlike pursuit, right? And I think that is in capitalism and in society, these Euro-American capitalistic dogmas. We the loss of that childlike element is very intentional. It's a forced loss, but I don't actually think that people would become all. I think this huge dichotomy we have between adult and child is overstated, and more than it is a biological like certainty or something like this, right? Especially as it pertains to like elements of our psyche. Certainly, your brain changes, and there are measurable differences in many ways. But in terms of like the capacity for wonder, I actually think that so much of it is a trained, you know, what was programmed obsolescence or something. This like idea in society that I think it's a cultural artifact, at least, and it would be hard to measure this, right? But there seems to be this something, forced into labor, forced into sort of like these high like life or death consequences of it trying to exist in late stage capitalism, not just the late stage. Honestly, frankly, children who've been forced into labor for all of capitalism, really. And then I think that this, I don't know. So there's this idea here that I'm pulling on, but again, it's kind of hard to give a cursory treatment of it. But what I kind of am probing into is this idea of like, so we're taught about evolution in this competitive framework, this idea that, there is biodiversity is sort of this, like, it comes at, despite, it's kind of this paradox. Actually, I cite in that work on called Purple Thunder, a paper that recently came out called The Diversity Paradox. And some ecologists were writing about how, sort of they were tracing the very capitalistic roots of a lot of ecological frameworks and evolutionary frameworks that are highly deployed within ecology and evolutionary biology. And they talk about this idea of double transference, right? Which is basically this idea that capitalist thinkers who are very explicitly very excitedly pro-capitalist, and who were also explicitly eugenicists, formed a lot of the foundational theories in following evolution and in ecological theory. And they basically, this idea of double transference is that they had these biases that they were quite fond of, and they projected them onto the natural world. And then either through like accident or sheer indifference, they, after projecting, like, for example, market capitalism onto species competition, they then point to the natural world and say, look, capitalism exists in the natural world, and that's why it's normal for us to do it too. So that's this idea of double transference. And they look to nature as like, oh, see all this competition, how horrible it is and how cutthroat it is. That's just nature. When we do it, we're just, this is just what it's like to be alive in the world, right? So that's sort of, I'm like, this idea, pushing back against that is something that some scientists are doing. I wouldn't say a lot of scientists are doing. Some scientists are doing, and I feel very, compelled to then explore. Okay, so what is, if it's not competition, like, what is it, right? And of course we do. I just want to be totally clear. Competition does happen. It does exist, and it is a part of evolution, and it is part of the story of being alive. But it is not the disproportionate weight we've placed upon that. Just doesn't hold water, right? The amount of emphasis we've put on it is not accurate. But when you really think about, if it's not competition, like, what is it, right? And this is where you get into something about this, enlivenment and vitality and these ideas, right? And this is where pleasure comes in and stuff like that.
Amazing. Obviously, once you pointed to the fact that it's going to be in your book, I'm going to point people in the direction.
Yeah.
So when it comes up for you to kind of, I also into this during this conversation, and then it fruiting when you.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to tease it. It's actually a little bit. There's layers, so I don't want to trip over myself too much trying to explain it here. But
no, I think I see a lot of the conversations that we have here as kind of laying the groundwork for people to have people probe on their own rather than give all the answers. So it's nice to kind of have all these different ideas going off at the same time, which is how I feel right now.
Yeah, same.
And so I wanted to end with a final question, which is a more, I hope, like, light question. In mycology as a queer discipline, you end with this quote, which I really love, and I want to read. It is past time that humans turn to the fungi to which we are bound, step into our mutual totality, and create space and futures for our wild ways of being. And so I wanted you to speak about that wild way of being, and also a wild way of knowing, which, yeah, I think how are you kind of doing that in your life, in your work, or right now, and share that a little bit with people.
Cool. So I guess I'm first sort of thinking about just like releasing the shackles of like what the prescribed, right? So certainly as a person who's queer, as a person who's sort of like, I don't know, I've always felt that I've had this shape shifty element to myself as being displaced ancestrally, coming up and then growing up in the United States, which is such a crazy project. Right? And and so I've just never had the whatever currency seems to be like the way that this society deals in. I just never felt like I've actually had it. But just releasing myself of that desire to perform in capitalism in these particular ways, I think is one way of, wild ways of being, right? I'm not actually someone, I have to work and I have student loans and stuff. So I certainly feel there's material needs that I'm not suggesting. Certainly we can't all at this moment just instantaneously pull aside, or I guess release ourselves from entirely, but I guess emotionally finding the inner part of yourself that is a creature, right? The creature parts that lives within us, and finding ways where we can nourish each other through caring for ourselves, seeing each other as as beings in this world that are that need to be nurtured in ways that are consistent with our ecological heritage. So this is meaning being outside, being in community with complex community, interspecies communities. And you don't have to be in a pristine wilderness to be in touch with nature, right? Finding connections to other beings can happen in dense urban spaces. They could be with but some of that might require reassessing your judgments of other organisms, like pigeons, for example. Like, they're one of our greatest companions, but we look down on them. Or various weeds and species that have been, I like thinking of bioaccumulafe's discussion of fugitivity here, right? Thinking about the other, we are fugitives in this particular, in this context of the Anthropocene or the Plantationocene, which Donna Haraway and Anna Singh talk about, right? Instead of, and how do we move through this again to think about Anna Singh's language, on the seams of empire, right? We are kind of, she talks about how biodiversity and social diversity huddle in the margins, where state control is sort of just at the we're just beyond state control, right? So I like this idea of tapping into that, however it feels good for you. Like, for some people that it is really going off into the woods, right? But then for other people, it could just be opening your heart to finding complexity in the relationships in the city that you live in, right? So that's kind of, I think, just literally wilding your, increasing your species encounters, having as many species encounters as you can each day and making them meaningful. So again, it's not about having 1,000 species encounters in a day, but it might mean deeply caring for the small interactions that you have, like the chicory sprouting through cracked asphalt, right? Or the little pigeon, the mourning dove that nests in your windowsill. These are the things that I think can if you keep your heart open to them, in this childlike way, it will, the wildness kind of creeps in. And I don't really think once you're allowing it in, it doesn't really leave, right? So I think that's the biggest thing. And then I guess this other aspect is specifically queer ecology of wilding science. So what I'm, as a scientist, I'm teaching a seminar in queer ecology at Bard, and just applying this lens to my work constantly, and just thinking about how it kind of it shakes up the narrative of science. And you realize that science is, while it's a really powerful tool, it is a collection of human endeavors, right? And it's flawed deeply in many ways. And finding the ways in which we can improve its increase its accountability to ethics and to care through complicating stories that have been told within the discipline. That's another way of, I think, wilding, right? So
Thank you so much for sharing that. And that's a beautiful way to close. So I'm just gonna leave that
thank
for
you.
people to be thinking about. Yeah, and I yeah, thank you so much for sharing space with me
Thank you
today.
for having me. It's been really fun to talk to you and to work with Advaya. I'm really excited for the course that's coming up, and I'm just honored to be involved and teaching alongside so many great thinkers, and grateful for all the work that you've done to put it together.